what's next. So we're really excited to have you with us today. I'm Valerie Jacobs. I'm the Chief Growth Officer and founder of our Trends and Foresight practice at LPK. And I'm one of your hosts today. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Brian Goodpaster, Senior Creative Director and Head of our Trends practice, and Suzanne Schneider-Wright, Group Director and Client Experience person, and an expert in the power and business value of foresight. We'll hear more from Brian and Suzanne in just a minute. We're excited to jump in, but of course I have to cover a little bit of housekeeping with you guys. So today's meeting is being hosted on Zoom, which I think we're all pretty familiar with by now. But to minimize interruptions and to ensure strong connectivity, we ask that you keep your audio muted and your camera off. We also want to let you know that we're recording today's event and we'll be sharing it with you in a follow-up email. Finally, the images used today are for educational and commentary purposes only, and all rights remain with their original owner. So the digital roundtable is really about coming together for a rich conversation. We're all about a free-flowing dialogue, and we love it when you jump into the chat throughout with any questions or thoughts that you have. And we'll keep an eye on it as we go through the content today, and we'll field as many of your questions as possible. And we plan to leave about 15 minutes, 10 minutes at the end of the presentation so that we can cover that. So it's really pretty likely that one of us or LPK to some degree. But if not, LPK is a global consultancy specialized in branding, innovation, and customer experience. We work across a lot of diverse categories, partnering with businesses of all shapes and sizes to ultimately create brands that are both timely and timeless, ones that resonate in the current culture, the future culture, and also stand the test of time. A few years back, we started the digital roundtables so that we could have a forum with our clients and colleagues to have safe and tough conversations about business challenges that we might all be having, to speak the unspoken truths, and to elevate the hard realities of our industries. Today, we're going to use this forum to look forward to life beyond 2020. Honestly, I personally, and I don't think anyone on our team has ever seen so many powerful forces of change in motion all at once, affecting the way we lead our personal and our professional lives. We're working differently, we're connecting differently, our priorities have shifted, and likely will shift again. We're all yearning for a stronger sense of what's coming and how to best prepare. And today, Brian and Suzanne and I are going to walk you through 4 plausible but divergent future worlds that our in-house team has developed over the past several months. It's based on everything that we see in the landscape at this time, and kind of is bringing those forces together to think about the different ways that life might unfold over the next 12 to 24 months. We'll talk about what life looks like and feels like in each one of these worlds and how you might use these to prepare in a proactive way. We'll get into all of this with Suzanne and Brian, but first let's learn a little bit more about them. And I'm going to start with Brian.
Hello. I'm trying to progress the slide here. There we go. All right. Hello. And thank you for joining us. As I'm looking through the chat, I see a lot of fellow practitioners, fresh faces. So welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brian Goodpaster. I'm Senior Creative Director of Trends and Foresight at LPK. As one of the founders of our Foresight practice, I've practiced landscape scenario planning across multiple sectors, ranging from hair care to healthcare. And I have to say that there has not, in my lifetime, been a more crucial time for applying strategic tools to chart what's ahead. Unfortunately, for many, these crises has presented a time of terrible upset. For some, however, this has been an opportunity for reset. So I'm excited to walk through this material with all of you today. Suzanne?
Hi, I'm Suzanne Schneider-Wright. I'm a group director at LPK and Client Experience. And I've been at LPK for a number of years. I've probably worked with a number of you. I've been working with Valerie since the beginning. We've been since we started developing the trends and foresight capability. I have also been working with Brian for the better part of the last decade. Much of our work focused on landscape scenario planning efforts. Brian mentioned the diverse categories. My main strategic goal is to make sure that our trends and foresight work really is activated on our businesses and that it solves our business challenges, be that driving strong innovation strategy or building future ready brand strategies. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. And it's really been a total pleasure to build out these capabilities at LPK with Brian and Suzanne over the years. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Valerie Jacobs. I'm the Chief Growth Officer and a longtime futurist at LPK. And most of you know that about me, but what you may not know is that I actually wrote my thesis in graduate school on landscape scenario planning. So this is like my nerd geek zone about what we're going to talk to you about today. And so let's jump right in. And today what we're going to discuss is where we are in the extraordinary year that is 2020. We'll look ahead to see where things are going in 2021, 2022, told through 4 potential future scenarios. We'll talk more about the strategic planning method that we use to get to these narratives. It's called landscape scenario planning. You've heard us dropping that name a little bit already. And how this is a method that helps you plan for uncertainties and develop your response. And then we'll save some time for Q&A. Okay, so, as a futurist, I'm hardwired to think about what's next. But we'd all kind of be lying to ourselves and each other if we didn't acknowledge that 2020 has left us with a sense of future fatigue. Now, I love this phrase. I didn't come up with it, but someone I really admire did. His name is William Gibson, and he's a really famous science fiction author. And I was reading an article, actually one that Brian sent me several months back, even before COVID-19 hit. And William Gibson was basically talking about how science fiction writers have always been enamored by the century that is to come. So in the 19th century, they were writing about the 20th century. In the 20th century, they were writing about the 21st century, but he was seeing that science fiction writers really weren't writing about the 22nd century. And so he felt that there was a sense of malaise about thinking about the future and envisioning what it might be like. And he called this being future fatigued. So for the most part, you can also think of this not just as something on that type of a time scale, but you can think about it on the short term that we have right now, which is the fact that it's kind of hard to think about the future when the present feels kind of, hard. So then you throw in all of the extraordinary events of 2020, and it's safe to say we're all kind of feeling exhausted. But we can't give up on the future because it's really never mattered more. And as we navigate global health crisis, worsening climate change, political turbulence, and civil uprising, it's clear that the forces that are in motion right now will transform what our lives look like and feel like for years to come. At LPK, we use trends and foresight to help people not just make sense of these forces, the trends themselves, but to synthesize them into stories that unlock future worlds. We call this becoming future fluent. Really, that just means we immerse ourselves in the change, envision ourselves in these different future states, and develop sort of an ability, a personal capability, sort of like a sixth sense for anticipating the outcomes and increasing our ability to act wisely on behalf of ourselves and our businesses. And really, it's the best way that we can embrace change and turn uncertainty into opportunities.
All right. I don't know about you, but is anyone else tired of hearing the phrase the new normal? Or listening to colleagues on a Zoom call talk about how weird this is? I recently heard a colleague say that nothing about 2020 is normal. And it holds true when you look at how we've been using landscape scenario planning, one of our future forecasting methodologies. Historically, LSP, or landscape scenario planning, has been a long-term planning tool used to look decades out and get a sense of future threats and opportunities, the divergent potential contexts that your businesses may reside within. But this year, the pandemic has accelerated everything. We're now using LSP as a near-term tool. And it's really an imperative exercise for any business navigating their way into 2021. LSP is helping us look 12 to 24 months into the future, glimpsing future worlds for all of these accelerating forces in the near-term capacity that businesses can action against. And those words, this life beyond 2020, is exactly what we're going to talk about today. And so here we have 4 divergent worlds. The worlds are techno heroes, the year that woke the world, arduous transformation, and choreographed reclamation. And I want to emphasize that the entire point of this exercise, that is landscape scenario planning, is divergence. Why? Because as human beings, we're hardwired against change. In fact, it's nearly impossible for many of us to imagine a world that is not a simple derivation on today. In fact, it's even more difficult to imagine a divergent world where we, or the brands and businesses that we work for, are not in a position of power. So this is the point of divergence that we'll walk you through today. So before we jump into the 4 ways forward, let's talk a bit about the mechanics of landscape scenario planning. First, we create axes. In this case, we focused on COVID-19 for our vectors. Here, the top half represents scenarios in which the virus is contained and under control versus less contained at the bottom half. And then we thought about the degree to which technology plays a role, and that was plotted against the horizontal. In this process, we created a variety of potential futures, including issues of economic recovery, inequity, climate change, intersectionality, and social justice reform. But for today's presentation, we've chosen to articulate these 4 divergent spaces. Some of them may seem improbable, some plausible, and others preferable. And then there may be worlds where you recognize plot lines because they feel like something you may be experiencing today. Again, the point of this exercise is divergence. And with that divergence, it allows us to arrive at strategies that are effective across multiple of our scenarios. And with that, I'll hand things to my colleague Suzanne to talk a bit more about that.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, just to build on that, this process always takes into account certainties and uncertainties. I think we can all agree that in 2020, we have far more uncertainties than certainties, and it feels like there's a lot of unknowns versus knowns. So if we proceed to develop strategies that work across multiple divergent scenarios, these strategies will be strong and highly valuable as we prepare our businesses for 2021 and beyond. Now I think what you've all been waiting for is for Valerie to start to take us through the scenarios themselves. And so we're going to take you through the scenarios we've prepared for today.
Yeah, okay. So here we go. The first world that we're going to talk about is called Techno Heroes. So this is a world where big tech saves the day and for all practical purposes sort of redeems themselves. So imagine that we get widespread adoption of a track and trace tech solution that could help us immediately identify where outbreaks of virus would occur. We could then treat them sort of like a flare and fight. So when something popped up, you'd be notified, you could isolate, and then we could quickly knock out the virus. The other thing that big tech would do is they would begin to root out biased code. This would be a solution for our inequality. They'd also elevate truth and help us repair the division that's occurred. I think also they would fuel the economic recovery in this world. Now, all of this would enable us to have more mobility, a stronger sense of connection, more unity, and drive the recovery, but it would come at a price. In this world, the price would be for our privacy and anonymity, and you could certainly see people in the ACLU having lots of problems with how this data might be used. So in this world, I really think that we would, the way that we would get here might be where we would finally have some bipartisan support for something like a Patriot Act 2.0, where there would be virtuous surveillance and both parties could get on board because they would see the benefits, whether that was from the economic recovery or it could be for public health. I think no matter what happens in this world, we would see continued and increased tech acceleration, especially of emerging technologies. And I think we're already seeing this. For example, pilots of drone delivery have been approved. Also, you could see where self-driving cars might make more of an accelerated adoption to do things, maybe less so to take us around, but maybe to take things around and to make deliveries. I think one thing that we could use all the data for in this world would be to certify safe places in real time. So where you could and could not go, or should and should not go. I think also if we had sort of this flare and fight world, you'd see that businesses could create plans to operate into two different modalities. So they might have one when they need to be more contained and another that would operate more like business as usual. So in this world, I also think we'd have lots of wearables that would enhance our health and our daily activities. And I think in this world, I feel that this is kind of the path we were on in many ways, but with a lot of digital acceleration, and it would feel more like our old lives. The only downside is the cost of our privacy and anonymity. So let's move on to the next world.
Oh, real quick, Val, before we move on.
Oh, yeah.
I think this was just making me think, I think you're spot on with the growth in e-com. I think some people have said it's been pushed forward 5-10 years faster than it would have been without the pandemic. And obviously we see with our partners and other businesses that those that were prepared to pivot and meet the consumers where they are the ones that are succeeding. They were prepared to speed up. And I think this type of methodology, obviously allows the teams to think through these possibilities and how they're going to respond to these either challenges or opportunities when they present themselves. And then I agree with you mentioning wearables and thinking about the businesses that have come forward, especially in health and wellness, and how that's impacting the health category across a multitude of our clients. So I think you're right. That's the trajectory we were on, and definitely something we still see playing out even amongst the significant changes. And then I think it's worth noting that there's some folks like Amazon that we know are doing really well, but also other businesses like Target and Wayfair that have made some big strides. And again, it's about being prepared and thinking about what the consumers are going to value in that new world.
Oh yeah. Thanks, Sue. Yeah, definitely Brian and Suzanne jump in, and I'm sure it will shock no one that we've been talking about this content, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves some of the things that we were already thinking about and the strategies that we think will be really robust. So let's move to the second world, and this is the year that woke the world. So in this world, the logic that would lead to this world really would have to include something that would intervene and in the spread of coronavirus and a treatment for COVID-19. And that could be anything that might be preventative, a vaccine, it could be a new protocol, but something would basically help us get back to, our old lives. That said, I think this world would also leave us with a lot of brokenness in our world, a broken economy, a cultural divide, political divide. I think there would be a lot of questioning of how things were handled, and a lot of, just probably anger. Did we make too big of a deal of it? Did we not make enough of a big deal out of it? But I think where we'd be left here is with a wake-up call. And so I think that all of these scenarios kind of have a, a yin yang, a positive side and a not so positive side. I think in this world, what we might see is that our state and civic leaders would be revered for the way that they handled things. But I think also we'd be left with a lot of federal anti-government sentiment in this world. I think this world would leave us with a K-shaped economic recovery, where it would become very pronounced that the rich became a lot richer during this year, and that the poor became even poorer and more marginalized, hit harder. And I think that could, it is a whole different type of divisiveness. I think in this world, you would have lots of lawsuits, class action style lawsuits. Could be against healthcare entities. You could have lots of people claiming corruption with the PPP loans. I mean, basically, this would be where the virus is off of the news cycle finally, but everything else would be burning, churning, and in everybody's face. I think the positives in this world is I think that corporations who've stepped up during this the equity conversation this year would actually make good on the promises that they've made. I think also people have learned in this time that we may need a new leadership paradigm, and one that's filled with more flexibility and autonomy for the people that are in the workforce, one that requires leaders to be more vulnerable and humble and transparent. And I believe that there are things that have come forth that would be positive and would stick. And I think that in this world, you might see also a lot of reimagining of our systems. And so I think that while this would be a grief-filled world, it still has some positive elements.
Great.
And Val, a lot of our clients are really focused on being mindful about their values and how they act on those values. We know that brands are not being rewarded for sitting on the sidelines without a point of view. Yep. And Brian, I know you sent me that example recently of Axe Canada, a personal care brand. They were challenging stereotypes based on gender and facilitating consumers to praise up and share male expression of emotion and affection. This campaign connected with consumers that have walked away from those traditional gender roles and stereotypes and wanted to display more inclusivity. So I felt like that example, Brian, was really highlighting, the importance of using the insights that are in alignment with our brands and our consumer values, and reflecting those shifting attitudes and values that we see in the landscape.
Yeah, I think now it's really an imperative for all businesses to increase their corporate transparency. I think we've seen large CPG companies like P&G and others take steps in that regard, but I think we'll see a lot more. I think particularly Gen Z will have a pretty hefty bar for what it means to be corporate and be responsible. And I think we will likely see the birth of what it means to be an anti-racist brand or an anti-racist organization. And this is a world where I would see something like that transpire.
Yeah, I think even though in this particular scenario, as I mentioned, the devastation is real, but it gives us a chance for that wake-up call. So, all right, let's talk about world 3. This world is a world of arduous transformation. As Brian mentioned, when we kind of looked at the driving forces, this is a world where we do not have a health or pharma intervention. We don't have a tech intervention. And we kind of don't have much of any type of intervention because we're sort of left in a Groundhog Day. And it kind of feels like where we might be headed at this moment, where we're kind of facing the potential for a third wave of virus in the United States. And we don't really have anybody bringing us together for solutions or, unity. So in this world, as we say, I think arduous is the right word for the title here, because, slogging through it will be slow. And it's going to mean that new norms will take root. I think, we still are wobbly on how we even want to handle reentry. And I think in the future, if it still goes bad, these chances of, going back into culture and society are kind of, I don't know, just make you feel like you're not sure, and sort of the whiplash of kids in school, not in school, et cetera. I think that we'll become more skeptical over time in this world of any attempts to reenter. And so it's going to cause us to have long periods of sheltering in place, to feel more isolated. And that may be self-imposed and with our groups of friends and family. But I do think, and I think people are already seeing this now, that it's made them feel more connected to each other, and or just interconnectedness to other beings on the planet. But in this world, I see that the hope would reside in resiliency across businesses, our personal health, planning, economic recovery. And in this world, we may need to look to luminaries to actually create our social cohesion. And while I think it will take a long time to dig out of the economic recovery, I think we really wanted to dial up in this world, again, because as Brian mentioned, you want to push these as far as possible into divergence. We were like, well, what might come out of a world that lingers in this state? And we're like, would that be enough to get people to develop a new social contract? So when you take this to as far as you can, that new contract might look like universal basic income, universal health care, stakeholder capitalism, and sort of a rethinking of our democracy. And I think, again, you push these scenarios really far. And when we were creating these, we jokingly called this Bernie world. So we'll come back to this world in a few minutes, but just be thinking about how we might actually land on a very transformative moment, even if this is something we're in for the long haul.
Yeah, I think this is a world that reminds me of post-war recovery, where grassroots systems are needed. And one of the things that is probably crucial to having this actually transpire is some sort of across the aisle coordination, which makes this a tenuous but yet divergent.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think the tenuous nature of this scenario, when we were talking about it internally, it's a really good example of why we've leaned into this methodology and look at these diverse worlds. I think when Valerie and Brian were putting these together initially, I was tripping on this one a little bit because it feels really hard to predict. And the results of the upcoming election weigh so heavily on how influential this scenario will be. But again, it just highlights the value that this process brings to make us think through these potential worlds and outcomes. And then, consider the strategies, implications for our consumers and our businesses, and how are we going to set ourselves up to succeed, even when we're at these endpoints that we might not have been anticipating otherwise. And then I think Brian had some great ideas when we were connecting last week in regards to, what does this mean for our clients? It could be that brands need to really empower consumers more, facilitate DIY, have knowledgeable associates. So it just helps to keep pushing ourselves and to think through, what are the strategies that win if this does happen? What are the strategies that win if this doesn't, if we go the other route? But obviously a lot hinging on what's going to unfold in the next couple months. So definitely we're on the edge of our seats as looking for signposts and how this is tracking.
Yeah. All right, well, let's get through the fourth world, and we'll speed up a little bit so we make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So the fourth world is one where we move through into the future through choreographed reclamation. So again, as we mentioned, the bottom half of these our axes are where we don't get a solve from anyone. This is a no one saves the day. But in this world, people come together one-on-one as human beings to unite and quell the crisis through careful coordination. This is a world where human improvisation, peer-to-peer innovation comes to the forefront, and we might have something like social distance design pervade all of our experiences and reimagine spaces, places, and interactions. So you can imagine like totally new retail design in this world. You can also see that small businesses might pivot to concierge style services at home, one-on-one, by appointment. And I think you even might have in this world, since this is a world where the virus isn't really contained except, from our behavior, that traditional manufacturing may still have to make a lot of PPE. And so they might even have sort of a legacy model and then a plus model where they have to do something that helps fight the pandemic. So Sue and Brian, did you guys have anything you wanted to add on this world?
I think this is I think that within all of these worlds, you would see a lot of digital transformation, but of the four, I think this is the one where brands, businesses, organizations need to get the most creative in order to meet their consumers' needs in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, I was even thinking, and everybody might not be local on the call today, but a couple of weeks ago, the Cincinnati Ballet actually had a very choreographed experience. So they had to completely, and not just choreograph for the dancers, but there was a whole choreograph of how guests would arrive, how you would be seated. It was all outdoors in a completely unfamiliar venue. It was, but it just reminded me of what our future might start to look like if that's what it takes for us to kind of have the life experiences that we still really, really desire to have. Okay, enough. Sorry, go ahead.
To build on that really quickly, there's also similar in a local company from Cincinnati is part of a pilot right now in NYC. They're doing some new restaurant dining experiences in Times Square right now. And that idea is really, how do you create those, make patrons feel safe and create those physical barriers that are in step with health guidelines, but without diminishing the experience. And so there's some really interesting ways that people are doing that in the restaurant industry as well as retail. And then I think I remember when we were talking this internally, it also is interesting to think about the implications for all the places like the Starbucks of the world that had been designed to be third spaces, and now, during the pandemic, they became increasingly transactional due to social distance measures, et cetera. And so this is challenging a lot of us to think through what those experiences are that our consumers are going to want and what that balance is, both in the physical environment and the digital experience.
Oh, great points. Yeah, it's been so interesting to, watch the headlines as we have kept developing these scenarios, and that kind of really brings us to how you really use these and what the implications are. And so for example, you develop these, there's generally you may even have more than four. I think we've had 6 or 8, and you kind of get down to the 4 that you think are the ones that are the most powerful, that drive, that are most divergent, that drive innovation. And you write the story, and then you actually create sort of these headlines from the future, things that you would imagine to be ripped from the media or the news. And those are the headlines that would be happening in this future. So, but that's also then what you use as you move along in time, as you're coming through, from 2020 to 2021 to 2022 and out, you kind of monitor those headlines you wrote and see what's actually showing up in the news. And you kind of think of those as signposts. And what that does is it helps you understand which of these worlds is unfolding. And so that's why it's been so interesting to actually watch all of this. And we kind of already got into this a little bit, but that's why, for example, the way we have arduous transformation unfolding right now, it could be a scenario that is completely not viable when the election results come in. So, and in this case, what we'll do is we'll go back to some of those scenarios that we maybe put to the sideline. And because you could kind of see that, if Trump wins the election and the House flips, I think you will not see some of the things we discussed, like a universal basic income or, Medicare for all or things like that. But let's say also Biden could win in a landslide on the popular vote. Trump could still win the election, and you would end up with a very divided nation. So what we do in those situations is we go back and either pull forward a scenario that we still have in our back pocket, or we say, okay, we understand that this is still going to be a world of an arduous future, an arduous march forward, but there's still an opportunity for transformation in this world, but it might not be from government change. It would be more like from people or grassroots movements. And so I think that's also what makes this methodology so fascinating, is not only does it, propel you into thinking about all of the different ways things might unfold, but it also gives you a tool for monitoring that along the way.
So I think it's worth highlighting, again, based on you sharing that tenuous nature of the scenarios, it's why we've dedicated energy to developing this capability. And at the end of the day, we're using this methodology to essentially push our teams to consider what's possible and how to best prepare for the future.
Yeah.
It's allowing us to develop those strategies to stay current on what's happening and hedge our bets, and to try to understand what could gain steam the fastest and potentially help us win. It's not about predicting the future. It really is about developing those strong strategies. And I did want to call out, while we have this forum with you, that it's important not only to use these to develop new strategies, but it's a valuable resource to use to vet your current business strategies as well, to validate them and or to challenge and optimize those. So I would think of it in more than one way. And again, that's why we've dedicated the energy that we have to this methodology and even hacking the approach, so that we could have some efficient methods to meet our clients' business needs as well as our own.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sue. So, okay, we've covered a lot today. So let's just recap a little bit. So first, we're really, really imploring people to become future fluent and to not succumb to future fatigue, but to think about the future, and to do this by envisioning yourself in future worlds, and to use the power of stories to, envision your business in that world. And then you kind of like deeply immerse and strategize your response. So if this world comes true, what would I do? What should my brand do? What should my business do? Then you have to come back and immerse in the now. And that's where you start looking for those signals and signposts, and you're monitoring them. Further, you prioritize what's next. You can look at those strategies and see which ones are workable in more than one of these futures. And you're always watching those forces because you're anticipating what's next. And that's because at the end of the day, this work is not about having a crystal ball. It's not about woo-woo. It's not even about predictions. It's really about preparedness for whatever future unfolds.
That's great.
So, okay, this has been, it's really been cool to present this work because we've been working on it a long time. We've, previewed it here and there, but this is the first like public kind of reveal. And I wish, when we were prepping for this, our meetings went over time by a lot because it's so energizing to us. And we've seen some like great questions coming in. And so, okay, Suzanne, can you like pose the questions, check in on that and pose those to us?
Yes, thanks. One that I'm seeing is one that we get pretty frequently, which is, which scenario do we see unfolding as the lead and or is unfolding the fastest?
It's a good one. It's a great one. And it's the reason that we create these divergent worlds, is to arrive at what ultimately will likely be a hybrid of multiples of these. So I don't know about you, but as I look at my morning feed, even though we've done so much research to develop these, sometimes my mind toggles that we're more in world 3, or are we actually more in world 1? The entire point of this exercise is not to choose the exact world. The entire point of this is to have preparedness for multiple outcomes, because as we've seen this year, the world is in a precarious state and anything could happen. So again, the point is to build strategies across multiple worlds. If you find strategies that are viable across multiples, those are what we call our safe bets, and those are key. Val?
Yeah, I was just gonna even say it in, like elementary school terms, like this is why we have fire drills. And so like if you have a fire drill and you practice your response, you're gonna be more nimble if the real thing happens. So that's why we say it's about preparedness. It's because when you're immersing in these worlds, you're actually practicing your strategy. Even if you don't act on it, it's sitting there and you know how to pull the trigger. And so I think what sort of makes people freeze when they're in a crisis is they don't know they haven't actually practiced a response yet. And so then while they're emotional and things are in chaos, they have to think clearly about what to do. And so I think that's the other value of this work, is that when you can have a calmer head, you're actually making your plan. And when that starts to unfold, you're like, I know what I'm doing. So I agree. I think it's less about thinking which of these worlds is definitely going to happen, and more about making sure your strategy is robust.
Mm-hmm. There's another good question here around these scenarios and if they're global or primarily regional, because we talked about the US a lot today. Can you speak a little bit about how we think about that as we're preparing for these types of initiatives?
I'll take that one. So absolutely, these were based on North America only, and even primarily the US, let's even just say that. And in the past, we have often done global scenario work. We felt going into this that the global response to the pandemic was so uneven that it would have been just far too complex for us to consider that. And then when you think about some of the other forces that have been prominent in the US over the past 7 months, like the social justice reform movement, wildfires, other natural disasters that were, not to say this isn't happening globally, but really in a specific way in the US, we we just decided that we had to keep this to the US. So while it's not how we always do it, there was just so many complex forces at play. It would have been, I think, practically impossible to make these, it would have made them, I think, too vague for everyone if we had done it at the global level.
Yeah. I think also there's such divergence on a state by state basis
Oh,
in
yeah.
terms of the response to a multitude of issues, be it racial inequality or the virus itself. I was fortunate to be in a presentation a few weeks ago with the Chief Futures Officer of Salesforce, and he actually talked about it in terms of not geographies, but almost treating it more as a heat map in a world where you might even treat Florida, for example, like a nation. So in that format, you might imagine variations of each of these four worlds happening across the nation or across the globe, depending on what stage of recovery or containment each of these geographies finds themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great example of how we can drive things up or down based on those nuances, and also from the consumer's point of view, and which consumer you can look at these through the lens of different consumers and focus on different nuances from that regard as well, and that can be very helpful. I think there's another good question in here on a hot topic of sustainability, which we've all been talking a lot about. In these scenarios in particular, as these have unfolded, what's the role of sustainability, and is it prominent in all of them, and or is it potentially shifting in a new way?
I can take that one.
Yeah, you start.
So one of the people that we look to, kind of a luminary that we like to keep tabs on, is Ajra Barber. She's a writer for The Guardian, and she talks about intersectionality, and she talks about sort of the intersection of feminism, race, inequality, and the environment as being inextricable issues. And I think as we got into these scenarios, that was becoming more and more evident. So our initial response, I think, was to buy a lot of consumer product packaged goods. But we're already seeing, some of these companies shift to more, sustainable deployment of these things. I think, I think certainly the environment and the environmental crisis is at play here. And I would say it's one of those things that was already accelerating and top of mind for consumers going into this. And then I think as people experienced themselves in sort of like life in suspension, there's been an explosion of interest in the outdoors, and I think a sentiment of understanding the precariousness that our world is in right now. So that would be my take, Val.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I really was excited about relative to our conversation today is that we have all of these scenarios in a draft form, and we are planning to publish a full report with all of the details on these scenarios in January, mostly because we want to see how everything kind of unfolds after the election, and that way we can reflect the most up-to-date information on the landscape. And then at some point we just have to put a pin in it, and we'll share it with you. And if you're interested in that, please pre-order the report and our companion trend report. But what I love about this conversation today is I think we probably haven't put enough in each scenario to kind of think of what the sustainability movement looks like in that world. And I could kind of like off the cuff say, well, if Techno Heroes is a lot about technology coming to save the day, I think it would behoove us to find those manifestations that show us how technology might step up. And that might be, new manufacturing processes or something like that. a great campaign around environmentalism. You could definitely see in the year that woke the world, you could say this also gave us an opportunity to wake up to climate change, our impact on the planet. People, early in the pandemic, we could literally see on satellite photos the rapid improvement in the environment and the planet just from people kind of staying home for several weeks or months. So you could see that really playing out in World 2, where we get the wake-up call, and then, arduous transformation. There could be a path there. So I appreciate that question, because I think it's going to make our team go back and think through that idea in each of the worlds. So thanks so much. So, okay, we're wrapping up, and I think we'll just, we all just got a memo about how we should end our meetings 5 minutes early to give everyone a break so that they're not just sitting on Zoom all day. And I hope that you'll join us next week for our second in the series of roundtables. I'll be hosting that with my colleague, Nick Partridge, who is the Vice President of Innovation at LPK, and we'll be talking more about how innovation will play a role in each one of these worlds, and how that is a way that we can strategize our responses in life beyond 2020. So thank you again for giving us your time today. We understand how valuable that is. We'll be circling back with an email recap and a recording of today's discussion. And so be on the lookout for that in your inbox. And if you want to talk more about this with me or Brian or Suzanne, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly. And I hope you're staying safe, happy, and healthy at home, and take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.